In Pasuk K, the Torah tells us that after the Kohen takes the two birds, slaughters one, and has his blood go into the water, takes the other bird, dips it in the blood, sends it into the wild, and then in Pasuk Ches, the Torah tells us of Chibes Hamitayres Begodov, meaning the one who's being purified, he has to immerse himself and his clothing in the mikvah. Chibes over here doesn't mean launder, it means immersion in mikvah. The Gilach has kol sorrow, and he cuts off all his hair. Rochatz b'mayim, the toyer, that means he has to wash. Rochatz over means immersion. And then he stays out of his tent, meaning he's not permitted to engage with his wife for 7 days. I mean, during this process, as we find by Kabbalah Satorah, when Moshe Rabbeinu is told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, tell them, Shu lochem lo'alechem. The Jews at the time of Kabbalah Satorah had to separate for 3 days from their wives. And he said, tell the Klal Yisrael, return to your tents. Shu lochem lo'alechem means go back to your wives. So during this process of purification, reinstatement, for 7 days he has to be separated from his wife. So initially, the Torah tells us the gilach is kol sorrow. He cuts off all his hair. And now, 7 days later, is kol sorrow. Again, he cuts off all his hair, whatever the new growth. That's it's rosho. And then it goes and specifies what does it mean, kol sorrow? The hair on his head, ezekono, his beard. Vezgabos enov, his eyebrows. Vezkol sori saleh yigalech, and all the hair on his body has to be removed. V'chibes es begodov, and again he has to immerse his clothing. V'rochatz es psor b'mayim v'toyer, and then he immerses himself in the water v'toyer, and he's purified. Now, there's a question over here. The Kli Yakar says something beautiful. Initially, when the process begins, the Torah just says, "V'gil ches kol sorrow," all his hair, which includes all the hair on the body. Doesn't specify the hair on his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. But the final part of the purification process, Torah says, "Yigal ches kol sorrow," pasuk tes. And what does that mean? It's rosho, that's there on his head, as a kono, his beard is gabus enov, and his eyebrows. Then it says, "Ves kol sori galech." So over here, the Kli Yakar explains that, and he asks a question. If we want to specify which hair, why does it first say all his hair, then it specifies the head, the beard, and the eyebrows? It should say he removes the hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows, and all the hair on his body. It concludes, it's being very specific, all his hair, and yet what specifically means, the hair on his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. So he says something interesting. Now, why did the leprosy come about? It came about due to arrogance, haughtiness. Now, why does a person speak Lashon Hara? Speak Motzi Ra, as the Midrash says. Why does he express this negative talk about someone? Because he feels he has a right. Since due to one's ego, pompousness, arrogance, I have a right to speak even negatively about whoever I choose. So that's gaiva, that's the head, what you have in your mind. The beard, now, through what part of the body does one express? That's the mouth. So this kono is the location that encircles the mouth. Gabus einov, we also said, as we read, it's tsor ayin. A person has like a very withholding eye. You see things, they bother you. Why do they bother you? The person is like an expansive person. You're happy for everyone. There's no reason to speak negatively. It only comes from the aspect, it's a lack of love for your fellow. So because you have that very narrow eye, it's called tsarayin, you don't have the wide eye, that you don't see your fellow in his totality. That's the reason why you speak negatively about him. I always say, it's very interesting when it comes to Lashon Hara. You have a person you see in a very positive light, and then you feel he disappoints you. And you're actually either offended or you're hurt by it, and immediately you see him in a negative light. Initially, you wouldn't consider saying anything negative about him because you see the totality of the person, that he's a good person. Now, because of this one particular incident, all of a sudden you see him in a negative light, and that's the only thing that you're touched by. So there's a narrowing of the eye due to something, an event that happens. Doesn't make sense. I always tell over the story. Alan would remember the story because he comes from this kind of background about Rabbi Levin. Rabbi Levin was known as the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim, and it was known that the Satmar Rav Zechat Tzaddik Levrocha, his name was, he was known as Rabbi Yolish. Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, Zechat Tzaddik Levrocha, he was not a Zionist. He was anti-Zionism, meaning what the state of Israel is about. Because it's not founded on what the Torah speaks about, many things. And this person came to Rabbi Levin, who loved every Jew. He was the rabbi of the prisoners, of the ones who fought for the war in the War of Independence of Israel. And he was about to unload on Rabbi Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rav. So before he was about to speak negatively about him because he was anti-state of Israel, he says, before we start speaking, I want to ask you a few questions. And then you'll tell me what you want to say about the Satmar Rav. He says, is it true that he's a man that he would help any Jew, whoever he was, even though he wasn't from his own sect of Hasidim? Definitely. Is it true that he would give the shirt off his back? Is it true? And anybody who has to be in a hospital, if you ever saw Satmar Bika Cholim in the hospitals in New York, anywhere, the level of chesed is unequaled. It's not to be believed. The way they do chesed, you're a Jew, Erev Shabbos, women pregnant, they're coming and they're delivering Shabbos meals, and they want to make sure you have enough. Maybe you need more. And during the week, literally, they don't ask for any compensation. They're happy to do chesed. I mean, it's a level of chesed unequaled. And he keeps going. He says, is this true about this? He says, definitely. And he speaks to him, asks about 5 minutes worth of questions, and everything's an affirmative. So after he responds, after 15 minutes, about how special the Satmar Rav is, his chesed and his givingness and his helpfulness, he says, now what do you want to say about the Satmar Rav? He says, I have nothing to say. I mean, the moment you're touched by that point that you feel pained or hurt or offended, all you see is that moment. The moment you expand that the vision of that person, you don't have the narrowing of that eye. Tzarayin, all of a sudden you don't speak negatively. So why does one speak Lashon Hara? I believe I have the right. That's the head, the mind, the way you perceive yourself. And how is it expressed? Through the mouth. And why? Because the eyebrows, because the eye saw the other person in a very narrow way, rather than seeing the totality of the person. This is, I'm telling you, the Kli Yakar. I was thinking, the Midrash tells us in this week's Parsha that Hashem created the mouth. The tongue is flat. You have teeth and you have lips. All kinds of fences, barriers that the tongue should not wag immediately. So the Midrash says, you can imagine if the tongue would be created in upright position, not in a lying position, not flat, but up. You can imagine how uncontrolled that tongue would be. So Hashem created it, it should be flat, that you should be able to contain it, to control it. And not only that, he put teeth around it and put lips to enclose it. And look the way a person can't keep his mouth closed. Okay? That's the medrash, what the medrash is about. So it's the beard with the hair of the face encircles the mouth. The eyebrows represent the eye, it's the tzarayim. And the head is what is the pompousness of the person. That's why the Torah is specific by writing. First it says he should remove all his hair. Then it speaks about the hair of the head, the beard, and the eyebrows. Then it concludes kol sorrow, all the hair. I had said, the Rambam in the laws of idolatry writes, a Jew is not permitted to round off his sideburns, the sides of his head. He's not permitted to cut your sideburns. So very rarely does the Rambam. Now the Rambam or in the Vuchim, Guide for Perplexed, he gives us rational reasons, because it's the Guide for Perplexed, to give a person a rational reason why things are not permitted, why one has to do certain things. In the Rambam, the Yad Chazak, which is all halacha, the Rambam very rarely gives us a philosophical background why something is not permitted. And he writes, why are you not permitted to shave off, to cut off the sides of your head, your sideburns? Because he says, because the priests of old, of idolatry, they would round off their sideburns. They would put a bowl on top of their heads and they would shave everything around it. You ever see pictures of the old friars? Friar Tuck. I'm not talking about Friar Tuck in. Friar Tuck, what he looked like. Because the priests, that's the kind of haircuts they would take. So I asked, but why? Why did they cut off? They left the hair on top of the head, but the hair on the side, they shaved that off. Why? So what I said was, the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, that when Adam ate of the Eitz Hadas, I've been here in the Garden of Eden, God openly communicates with you. You have a level of clarity, which is one of a kind, and God says you could eat of any fruit of the tree of the garden, except one tree. And then he goes and he crosses the line. I mean, how? With such a level of clarity and being at such a level, how do you do the wrong thing? So Gemara says, the moment that Adam ate of that tree, that fruit, he was a heretic. Meaning he had to suppress, because he has had such a desire to eat that, at that moment, God didn't exist in his life. A human being is created with the ability to suppress reality and live within his own reality to do what you want to do. What is that called? That's called ego. Because I believe I want what I want, everything becomes irrelevant at that moment. So Adam minhoya. Minhoya means he was a heretic. At that moment, God did not exist. But what is that? That's the brain. That's the head. That's the mind. It's what you believe, what you want. As a result of that, to emphasize that point, what's idolatry? Every idolatry is a deity. It's what you believe. I believe this, and therefore. And because everything emanates from where? From the intellect. So to emphasize the intellect, that actually drives the person. As a result of that, the hair, and also, as I mentioned, the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, before the sin of Adam, the human being didn't have hair on his body. The main hair on the human body is where? On the head, because that's exactly where everything came from. All the growth of sin emanated from the ego, from the mind, what you believe and what you feel. Therefore, the Rambam writes, the reason why the Torah says, Upas roshim lo yigalechu, lo sakif pas roshechem, you should not round off the corners of your head, is because the priests of old, of idolatry, they would cut that off. That's what it's all about. So therefore, the Torah goes and tells us over here, what is the exact cause of the tzaras? It's the mind, it's the mouth, and it's the what? It's the eyebrows, which emphasize the eyes, the way the eye sees things.